The presentation I did last June was around how to not recreate our own personal trauma histories at work and really centered on that connection between how we consciously and unconsciously play out our own patterning in the workplaces and in the companies we design, right? So that really is. That's the first thing that I think all of us as leaders of organizations and leaders of people need to pay attention to. What is unresolved in my own personal history that may be transferred onto my staff, onto my team, literally even into the policies and the structures of my organization.
Welcome to Reward, the podcast of The Trust. We are the show specifically for women entrepreneurs who want to build businesses into the multi-million-dollar revenues and beyond, but especially because we know the reward is much greater than that. I'm Allie Brown, and I'm excited to introduce you to these diverse female leaders from a variety of industries, women making huge impact and who are unwilling to settle for the status quo. On the web, visit jointhetrust.org to learn more about our modern community for forward-thinking 7- and 8-figure women entrepreneurs. That's jointhetrust.org. See you there. Now, get ready to enjoy this episode's powerful conversation. I am very excited for this conversation today because I feel like it is just so timely with everything going on not only in the world, but in our own lives. There's this like quickening and pressure, and it just feels like a pot that's about to boil over. And so on my calendar, when I saw Annie coming up for an interview today, I'm like, this is a great week to have this. And we're recording also the week before Thanksgiving. So add in some family drama and it's a full stew. You've got like all this stuff going on. So Annie, it's a pleasure to have you. I'm so excited to introduce everyone to you. And, you know, I'm going to let you give a little overview of your practice and background, if that's okay, because I prefer it to come from you.
Sure. Thank you, Allie. I'm so glad to be here with you too. And yeah, the week feels particularly salient, doesn't it? So just by way of introduction, my name is Annie Wright. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, very specifically a trauma therapist. And I own and run two companies. One is my personal brand, psychoeducation online course and training-based business. And the second is an actual brick and mortar therapy center, a trauma-informed therapy center located here in Berkeley, California, where I live, but seeing clients all over California and Florida. And I have a team of 18 clinicians and 5 administrative staff members there. And every bit of my work across both of those companies and in the world, whether it's through direct clinical service, the essays I write, the presentations I give, every bit of that work is really centered around supporting individuals who come from relational trauma backgrounds to A, understand that that's what happened to them, and then B, have the right tools and structures to go and transform and heal so that they can do good in the world and stop perpetuating any cycles of abuse. So that's a little bit of who I am and how I do my work in the world. And like I said, I'm really excited to be here and having a conversation that feels really important right now.
Yeah, yeah. Let's start off by defining trauma because you shifted my definition of that through our conversations just at the trust events and things and learning more about it. So previously, and maybe because it wasn't discussed so much, I would always think of, oh, if someone had trauma, that means they were physically abused or something. You know, they saw something horrible. I don't know, but you've really expanded the definition in my mind for being open to things we may have experienced or um, heard or, you know, stuff with our parents. Why don't you kind of open up what that means in your world and for us, what we should be thinking about?
Definitely. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I think most people have preconceptions around what trauma is and isn't. A lot of people think it's a single incident like a rape or a car crash, and certainly those experiences can be, or they associate trauma with veterans coming home from war. Or they think, well, you know, trauma is a very severe set of experiences. It's not what happened to me. But what we know from the field of traumatology and the way that I like to personally define trauma is that trauma is a subjective experience that overwhelms the brain's ability to cope. And when seen through that lens, it starts to really help validate an individual's experience because, of course, trauma can be a discrete event, rape, war, a car crash. plane crash. It can also be a set of enduring conditions that somebody lives through, whether it's an abusive, neglectful, or very dysfunctional childhood, or a grown up relationship with somebody who has a personality disorder. Right. So we can look
Mm,
at trauma through the lens of A, being subjective, and then B, not only one experience, but enduring conditions can also lead to a traumatic experience. And so, with a
mm,
wider lens, many of us usually begin to see our stories and our personal histories more clearly and start to understand how and why we were impacted, perhaps the way we were.
mm. I'm making notes of questions to ask you later
Sure.
because it's this topic is just so. When do you find when you start talking about this with people, it just starts going and going, and they have
It can.
enlightenment and questions and
It can. It depends on the person. It can shut a conversation down real fast, or it can
oh,
open up a
it's a real downer for the cocktail party, right?
totally,
They'll
yeah,
just
it's
walk away.
like a trauma therapist. Now let's see what happens next.
Dear Lord, I'm trying to have a good night. Yeah. So, you did a brilliant presentation for us. So within the trust, I'll share with everyone watching that we have these peer learning sessions, and we've had some great topics, everything from wealth building to tax strategies, and then Annie comes along and just blows our minds with what she wants to share. And it was about relating your work, Annie, though, to those of us who are we're leading people, we're
Mhm.
running businesses, we're out there doing our best to be successful and make an impact. Let's talk about the connection that there may be there in what we bring from our past and our personal life into the way we work, into the way we lead. I'd love to share some of this with everyone today.
Oh, yeah, I would love to talk about that. Um, the presentation I did last June was around how to not recreate our own personal trauma histories at work, and really centered on that connection between how we consciously and unconsciously play out our own patterning in the workplaces and in the companies we design, right? So that really is. That's the first thing that I think all of us as leaders of organizations and leaders of people need to pay attention to. What is unresolved in my own personal history that may be transferred onto my staff, onto my team, literally even into the policies and the structures of my organization. So it's a topic I'm super passionate about. But building onto that, there's this reality that beyond taking accountability for our own personal material in the workplace and resolving anything that may be at play for us, there is this responsibility that feels like it's growing every single day if we manage team members to support their mental health and well-being in the workplace. I mean, that responsibility has always been there, but recent events in the world seem to be highlighting the acuity of individuals' personal suffering and global suffering even more, putting more pressure on us as leaders to make sure that we are resourced and equipped enough to not only manage our own
Mhm.
stuff, but then to show up for our employees and also hopefully create trauma informed workplaces where they can feel safe and well enough despite what's going on in the world around us, which is extensive and enormous and deeply, deeply painful. And then you add
Mm.
on to that their own personal histories that might already be painful and triggering and challenging, whether or not they come from a trauma background. So I feel really strongly that there's a huge opportunity for us as leaders of 7, 8 figure businesses to not only do our own personal work, because it will certainly increase our own professional success, but the more we do our own personal work, the healthier of an organization we can create for other people to feel safe and held in. So I love this
Mm.
conversation. I present on it all the time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have around this.
Yeah. Are you seeing a lot of interest in this, or are people not making the connection?
Increasingly, and I think it depends on organizational size. Trauma is one of those words that it's a real live wire. There are certain sectors and there are certain sizes of organization who still need to be talked to in terms of employee wellness, right? Or HR. And there are
Mhm.
other organizations, I would say the larger the organization and the more millennial and Gen Z employees within it, the more the word trauma is welcomed and sort of run towards versus, seen as anathema.
Mhm.
So I think it really depends on the corporation type and sector and size. But in general, as we've seen with DE&I, it is increasingly a lens that corporations want to take in terms of supporting their managers to support their
Mm.
people and making sure they're reducing risk, liability, retaining employees. I mean, there's a real impact on corporation and professional bottom lines when they start to take a trauma informed lens in their workplace culture.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Well, we have a lot of data that shows, of course, it's more expensive to lose an employee and go out and get another employee versus retaining them. And there's certainly a financial risk in terms of legal liability and malpractice when you yourself are creating an environment that's unsafe or creating microaggressions in the room that lead your employees to then take legal action. There's also the reality that the younger generations of workers coming up are more concerned about mental health, more concerned about workplace balance, and they're more
Mhm.
drawn to organizations and corporations. I mean, top talent, right, amongst those generations is more drawn to organizations that take the whole person into account. So you can look at a
Yeah.
lot of different studies from a lot of the top consulting agencies that shows that much like taking a DE and I investment and lens, taking a trauma informed lens will also help the organization's bottom line as well as of course, improve workplace culture and the individuals within it.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. Um, let's shift gears back to those of us who are, we're running the businesses and we may be, it's more of a smaller size company or team,
Sure,
and
sure.
we're working directly with everyone. And, first we have to probably fix ourselves.
Sure,
Right?
sure. Yeah,
Let's start with that, and then maybe we'll go outward, because 'cause I'm thinking, "Gosh, there's so much to talk about here. Why don't we
so much to talk
take it
about. Right.
to ourselves?" How do we even know that this is something we should look at for ourselves as a business owner and leader? Is it something like absolutely everyone should look at, or are there little, like, red flags or, um, awareness of patterns, or, tell me what we should be looking for.
Well, I mean, do I think that everyone should be looking at this? Absolutely. Absolutely. In the same way, I think we should all look at the DEI and I lens that we hold in our smaller companies. I don't think we'd be remiss to take a look at this. Now, what what predisposes, I think about high risk factors, right? If I put my clinician hat on, I'm like, well, what are the high risk factors that say maybe you really need to look at this more than somebody else? Well, I mean, there's some known variables. Do you
I
have a
mean for ourselves too. You get that, right? 'Cause I
totally.
want to talk, like, ourselves for, okay, before, like, the
That's what
team.
I'm
Yep,
yep, that's
ourselves. Okay.
exactly what I'm talking about. If you yourself as a
Okay.
CEO or a leader come from a relational trauma history, a history in which you were raised by a mood or personality disordered parent, and or if you experienced any other set of traumatic conditions or experiences throughout your life, whether it was chronic bullying or it was racial trauma or it was acute circumstances such as houselessness or food insecurity, etc. If you yourself came from a trauma background, you are predisposed to wanting to take a look at this personally as a leader. You may have unresolved content in your personal history that could unconsciously come out on your staff and even in your policies. For example, right? I often see
Mm.
this, but very high functioning individuals can still have unresolved trauma impacts at play. The two things are not mutually exclusive. The neural circuitry that leads us to become professionally and financially and academically successful is really different than the neural circuitry required for relational aptitude and emotional regulation.
Mm.
So you can have a brilliant LinkedIn profile. You can have lots of money in the bank. You can be the founder of a startup, right? Or Ivy League educated and you can have unresolved, let's say, CPTSD symptoms at play. Now, how you might begin to notice this playing out in your organization, you could have heightened anxiety that's creating a sense of fear within your team around leads and lead generation cycles. You could be feeling, well, you could be overworking yourself and overworking your team without really understanding that the way that you're running yourself is not helpful for your team and you're about to lose employees, right? So for
Mm.
anyone who comes from a trauma history, I always say, well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at, what's unresolved in your personal past, how that's transferring out into your business, into your corporation. So that's one risk factor I think that predisposes people
Mhm.
to unconsciously play out their material in their companies. And there are other risk factors too. I think when I take an analysis, a clinical analysis of small companies, and we see employees jumping ship maybe more often than what is normative, that's always a clue to me that something's going on here, even if the individual, the leader, doesn't identify with having a trauma background. So those are two of the big
Mm.
factors I always look at.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm deciding
There
what to
is.
disclose and not for about myself. I'm deciding whether do I wanna go there and look at, like, what I've done. Um, I wanna talk about the parental thing for a minute because
Sure.
I'm drawn to it, and then I'm also kinda like, so for many of us, I'm gonna venture to say the Gen Xers and those of us who grew up in the '70s too, right? I don't know, I think sometimes we look at the things we grew up with and I'm like, "Well, that was like '70s parenting," right? That like, there's just kind of things that like maybe you had to fend for yourself a lot, the latchkey kids, things like that. And sometimes I just wonder, Annie, if we're overanalyzing everything, right? There's that one side. Like, are we like making so much out of maybe little things? Like, I start thinking, like, oh, my mother said this to me one time and all that stuff. So I'm going through that process in my mind. On the flip side now, I'm terrified that my kids are going to be sitting here one day having this conversation with you or your daughter one day when she's doing what you do and being saying, "My mom said
Mm,
this and that." Like, I'm just terrified of doing something wrong with them now. Like, I'm going through all these emotions when we talk about this stuff and like how our but there's no doubt that our upbringing and things that we experienced influenced us. So, where do we start? How do we start like acknowledging this and realizing, wow, this could be contributing to patterns in my life and not only my life, but how I'm leading and working with other people?
oh boy, there's a lot here.
I
Um,
just gave you a lot.
I wish we could have a 4 hour
You
conversation.
you pick and choose where you wanna go with that. That's just where my mind's going like, you know?
Well, I think you're naming really good points that that most of us come to look at, especially when we become parents ourselves. And I'm a mom of a 5-year-old daughter. So, as I have confronted my own personal trauma history and looked at the limitations of the people who are biologically my parents, I'm also very acutely aware I don't necessarily act in a completely regulated perfect way with my own daughter. And here's the thing, I wanna say a couple of different things about this, that's okay, right? We're
Yeah.
aiming
Yeah,
to
yeah.
do better than the generation that came before us. And one of the things that I rely on heavily day in, day out, and I talk to seriously every single parent I ever meet about, is the concept of the good enough parent from Donald Winnicott. He was a psychoanalyst in the 1950s who
Mm.
really developed this very, very important concept in response, in reaction to Freud and Jung, who were making everything the parent's fault. He talked about how it is actually the parent, a good enough parent. There's no such thing as a perfect parent, but there is a concept of a good enough parent who developmentally fails their child in age appropriate ways. For instance, and therefore sets them up for the reality of the world. So, what I mean by that is a good enough parent will disappoint and frustrate and even anger their child. Like, no, you can't just have ice cream and iPad for dinner tonight. I'm putting the iPad away. Here's the chicken and broccoli, right? Tantrum on the floor. It's actually okay to have them have these very big feelings and to fail them, as it were, because that's appropriate for the world. The world isn't going to meet them
Mm.
with perfect conditions all the time. And that's very
Mhm.
different than, let's say, a parent who drops a child off in the middle of Florida with no plane ticket at an airport and then just abandons them, right? Like, we're talking about developmentally age appropriate ways to fail a child versus true failure and a traumatic experience that would overwhelm that child's ability to cope. So let's
Mhm.
then talk about this a little bit too. What makes something traumatic? Something that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. Um, we as parents mess up all the time. I do it on a daily basis. I lose my cool. I'm dysregulated. I'm stressed. Parenting is the hardest thing in the world. You add on to that economic pressures, the stress of work. I mean, it's enormous. It's unrelenting, right? Not to mention our own personal histories. But what makes something overwhelming and impossible for a child to metabolize is when they don't have adequate internal supports to metabolize it themselves. And they don't have adequate external supports to come back and help them either repair the rupture that happened or make sense of what just happened to them. So, what do I mean by
Mm.
this? When we mess up with our kids, go back to them and say, I'm sorry. I really messed up. I lost my cool. I was so stressed. This is not about you. Help reduce the
Yeah.
likelihood of it becoming an overwhelming and therefore traumatic experience by going back and helping as much as you can to help them metabolize it, make sense of it, and create some sort of relational attachment after the rupture happens.
Yeah. That makes me feel so much better because
Makes me
I
feel
already identified one thing. When I grew up in a family that never said, "I'm sorry." We
mm,
would just, like, move on, and
yeah,
it's making me emotional.
yeah.
It's so important when I mess up or any of us mess up that we say, like, "I am sorry," and I love that you do that with your daughter. I don't know why it's
Oh,
affected me so much because I want them to know, like, I blew it or I messed that up and it's so normal for us now, and they'll tell me too, "Mom, I'm sorry," and I'm like, "Thank you," and it's the conversation and all that, so, yeah, but you can
mm,
get, when you I think it's these conversations that I do start worrying, like, they're gonna be sitting here one day, and I just have a feeling your daughter's gonna do what you do, and they'll be lying in her chair going like, "My mom, like, yeah,
aw,
or
mm,
she worked all the time." We're all doing our best, and I think they get it now. They're 10, my twins are 10, and I think they understand a lot more now, but the whole that's a great example of a specific one that just made me feel so much better about,
well,
you know, bringing them into this world and raising well-adjusted adults, really, which is kind of your end goal, right? That's what you
yeah,
want for them.
absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, Allie. One of the things I always say to, well, I say it in my own little family unit, but I say it to all my clients, to everyone I know. Rupture is inevitable. It's the repair that counts. Whenever you get two or more humans
Mm,
together, there are going to be disagreements, there are going to be hurt feelings, there are going to be tempers and fights. That's okay
mm,
as long as we attempt repair with them afterwards, because that is normal and that is natural. So, as you model that apology to your kids and say, I really messed up. I was super stressed. Oh man, I apologize. You're actually helping them internalize the skill of repairing after rupture, which is certainly going to serve them well in their friendships, their romantic attachments, in the workplace, etc. Right?
mhm,
And to
mhm.
this point, everyone says this. I'm worried my kid will end up in therapy. It's like awesome. I hope everybody has a therapist. And my baseline is to send my daughter for less than I had to go to therapy for, right? I mean, the bar was low, right? So, but I'm still like, if she ends up in therapy, awesome. She'll have a safe, trusted other to navigate the world with. And parenting is, I think it's a team sport. Like, I can't be her single source of everything. I'm
Yeah.
limited. So, she has me, she has her dad, my husband. I hope she has a therapist and I hope she has her friends' parents and coaches. And I think the more social support a kiddo has, even if it's a paid support, the better to steward them through adolescence and young adulthood.
Yeah. Oh, we could do a whole other show on the kids, but wow,
Sure.
it's so cool. Um,
Thanks.
going back to let's give people listening, if they're interested in us now and it's kind of piquing their interest, they're thinking, maybe I should explore some things that, maybe they want to be a better leader, maybe they know they have to sort through some things. What are the first steps?
Well, I'm trying to be mindful of not wanting to self-promote too much, but on the personal brand, on my own personal website, annywright.com. Am I allowed to say that? Am I allowed to
Of
direct people to
course.
that
Oh,
personal website? Okay, good.
hello. Yes. Everyone go to Annie's site because I have, by the way, you don't know this, but I read your blogs and I read your posts
Oh,
and they're
Ellie, thank
brilliant.
you.
So
Thank
she's a lot
you.
of great free information there.
Yeah, and I started that. I started writing, gosh, back in the spring of 2015, and the end goal there was always to provide really high quality psychoeducation information for people who may never afford to be able to be in therapy. Certainly not with me, or maybe even with anyone else, or they live in countries where therapy is still anathema, right? So again, my work is really heavily centered on relational trauma and relational trauma recovery, but it's very common for high functioning female founders and CEOs to identify when I start to talk about relational trauma. And there's always a question that usually comes up like, do I have relational trauma in my background? Go to my website. There's a completely free quiz called Do I Come from a Relational Trauma Background? Start with that. It'll then point you to all the best essays so you can
Oh.
begin to see yourself and your personal history a little more clearly. If you do really resonate with it, and maybe you won't, maybe you're like, no, not me. But if you do, I think one of the best things you can possibly do for yourself, your family, and for your company is to get into therapy. And I do mean with a licensed mental health professional, and ideally one who is further trained in trauma treatment modalities. You will waste less
Mm.
time, less money, and you'll see quicker returns in the improvements in your home and the improvements in your company.
Mm.
So,
Is that
certainly,
because, that there's a goal or there's a focus then that should bring a different result versus just lying on the c we think of traditional therapy lying on the couch for ages, right, and just talking and not really getting anywhere. So what
yeah.
you're talking about is there is an objective is to help heal and shift.
Well, I mean, there's certainly an objective to do that too with traditional talk therapy, psychoanalysis, sitting with your therapist, having a long-term relationship. And I want to be nuanced in how I give this answer. When our wounds
Yeah.
happen early in relationship, it's through relationship that they can be ultimately healed. So, if somebody has a long-term depth relationship with a general therapist who's not trained in trauma treatment modalities, that can still be profoundly healing. It just may take more time. By
Mhm.
working, however, with a trained trauma therapist who's trained in trauma treatment modalities like I am an EMDR or trauma focused CBT or neurofeedback, brain spotting, etc. Those are bottom up psychotherapy modalities, meaning they work literally with the body and the brain to help rewire the neural pathways of the brain. So treatment tends to
Mm.
be faster than talk therapy alone. That combined with a reparative relationship experience really, I believe, heals relational trauma. And certainly, one of the most common diagnoses, relational trauma is the experience that people move through. The outcome, if we were to give it a clinical name, is usually CPTSD. And trauma treatment therapies are the modality that we begin to use to treat the CPTSD.
Mm. Okay. So finding someone like that to help us
Finding
would be a
somebody
good
in
start.
your state, yeah, you can certainly do it via telehealth. It does have to be in your state, though. I can work with anyone in California and Florida. My team can as well. But if you live in a different state, start by searching Psychology Today and filter by trauma treatment modalities to find people in your
Mm.
state that would work with you. So, of course, many
Okay.
of us invest heavily into business coaching, into continuing education for our companies. That's amazing. That's wonderful. Also, get yourself into therapy is what I say to every founder I know.
Yeah.
And my caseload is
I love
full.
that, what's that?
My caseload is full of founders,
Wow.
co-founders, really high performing professionals because they know the more I attend to this, the more that impacts the quality of my work, the growth of my organization, my bottom line. So it's a wonderful investment.
You could actually probably host a great mixer. I know that wouldn't be professional.
I
Great
would
networking.
definitely get
Be
a
great.
license.
Let's bring them all together and they could, we could all meet each other.
Yeah,
Um,
if only I didn't need the
I do
license.
love, I'd say even 10 years ago, other business women and founders I would meet, you would never say you had a therapist 10 years ago. And now
Oh,
it's like, oh yeah, who's yours? And mine's up
that's
the street and she
awesome.
does this. And
Yeah,
oh, it's
yeah.
fantastic because oh my gosh, like, I didn't even realize how much I, loved it until I've spoken about this publicly, when I was starting to make some big decisions about my marriage and thinking through a lot of heavy things, and my mom, and putting her in assisted living and everything. I'm like, I need someone to talk to with no agenda except supporting me, because that
Yes.
you do not have that in, because even a coach, right? And I can flip to the coach mind because I do it privately for clients at high
Mhm.
levels. Even a coach has you know an agenda in holding that highest vision for you and holding you. I mean, just literally someone there just for my personal well-being. I've
Yes.
never had that in my life. I mean, then you think like there is no this is the only way to get that. I
Oh,
Unless it's an
it's
extraordinary friend or something, even just the talking, even just the
well,
talking.
and you have to remember too, I mean, therapists are bound by laws of confidentiality as well, right? So, as well-meaning as friends and family can be, like, there could be unconscious bias there, and there aren't those same
Good point.
confidentiality agreements, right? So, it's
Yes.
much like, patient-doctor relationship. It is a very special kind of relationship where you are the only point of focus, and that person's job is to take care of you, right? And to be impartial and to help you arrive at the answers that are best and true for you, not
Mm,
their answers, your answers. That's what I always say to my clients. I'm not the expert of you. You are. I'm the expert at
yeah,
asking the questions or using the tools that will help you connect to your own answers. Right. And so,
yeah,
yeah, in that sense, I think it's a pretty sacred relationship.
yeah, yeah, and just booming. I mean, are there more therapists needed than ever now?
Oh my God. We had a therapist shortage before the pandemic, and then the pandemic really well, it brought mental health to the forefront of the conversation. We all know this, right? And I think the data, the research I saw last suggests that we're 1.7 million therapists short in the country to meet the mental health demands that there are. And that's a massive shortage. When you think about the length of time it takes for someone to go through graduate school
Mm,
and through the licensing process, 1.7 million therapists short is it's quite a shortage. Now, what role AI can help us, play in terms of meeting mental health needs, especially in rural areas, that's a whole separate conversation. But yeah, there's a
mm,
pretty large need for therapists right now, and not enough people to fulfill that need.
mm. Annie, let's talk about gonna shift gears for a minute and talk about, your career and, going into this field and, what have been the evolutions and decisions that you've made to go in this direction, that have gotten you to where you are with you have a very successful practice. You speak
Mhm.
everywhere. You get a lot of attention in your messages and what you're bringing. So let's go through a bit about your background that people may not realize.
Sure. Well, I'm sort of that classic example of what's professional is personal. And the reality is, I come from a really egregious childhood abuse background, but I didn't know to call it that. I thought that's just how it was. And it wasn't until, I coped with my own trauma through some very adaptive coping mechanisms, workaholism, throwing myself into academics, becoming the first in my family to go to college, let alone the Ivy League. And again, just really excelling on paper. I had an undiagnosed eating disorder for 20 years that went along with that. And yet, I was also really running from my childhood trauma history. It all caught up with me, though, when I was serving in the Peace Corps in Uzbekistan after Brown. It was an example of implicit triggering that happened because of Peace Corps service. I'll talk about that in detail some other time. But that's when I started to kind of decompensate and the past caught up. I got myself into healthcare consulting, really frankly, just for the benefits to get some therapy. And then it was there that I learned about Esalen out in California. And so I did this thing that you
Oh
do when you're
yeah.
25 years old, which is like, quit your
Isn't that where
job.
did you jump in the hot tub naked? I heard, like, it gets so freaky there. No?
Yeah, Esalen hot tubs are totally, naked. You can wear your bathing suit, but you'll be one of the very few people who do.
Sorry, my mind just went like,
No,
"Annie's a
yeah,
hippie. Oh my
totally,
gosh."
totally. It's
But
a huge
sorry,
part no,
sorry.
it's a huge part of my story. Like, I'm happy to
Okay.
yeah, so I was so deeply unhappy, and my childhood trauma had caught up with me, and I was living in Washington, DC, and I was desperate for answers. Like, what is going on? Why is my life falling apart? Why am I falling apart? Why am I not happy? Well, I took a weekend workshop at Esalen called The Courage to Change Your Life. It was one weekend I squeezed between healthcare consulting clients in
Wow.
California. And by the end of that weekend, after driving onto the Esalen property, I was the happiest I'd ever been and the clearest I'd ever been that I had to be there. So I quit my job, sold my possessions, had a one-way plane ticket and only $16,000 in savings. 1 month turned into two there, turned into a year. I got hired on as an extended student, and then I was hired on to full-time staff, helping run the organization and taking classes. I share this because it was there. Oh, go ahead. Do you have a question?
I don't think I knew this. You maybe you
Yeah,
mentioned it at
yeah.
some point. This is fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely a different story, isn't it? It was there that I started to put myself back together, and I started to learn that what I lived through was not normal, and that it could count as childhood abuse, and here were the impacts on me, etc. And yet, still
Mm.
at that time, I wasn't working with a licensed trauma therapist, and nobody was saying to me, "Relational trauma is the experience you went through. Here's the outcome that it produced, and here's how we get you help." So I say all this,
Yeah.
Allie, and I'm happy to talk more about Esalen, but my entire career is a reaction to nobody having told me the thing earlier on that would have helped me more, quite frankly. And so I began writing and teaching about what relational trauma is, what the outcomes of it can be, and what's required to start to put yourself back together if you've lived through that experience and are experiencing that sort of constellation of
Wow.
symptoms. So I started writing really early on, even when I was still an intern, right? Not fully licensed as a therapist. I mean, I at that point, I still thought maybe I'll be a lawyer. But then, I went to graduate school for psychology because it was the thing that made the most meaning to me. And I knew I wanted to amplify this message, this work in the world. So I started writing. My writing started to get picked up by a lot of outlets. A lot of people started resonating with it quite early. And then I started to get more clients than I could handle. And I thought, okay, well, the next best thing to do is create a center where people can provide the kind of trauma treatment that I would have wanted 20 years ago. So my work
Mm.
is still, I do my clinical work with a very select group of high end clients. I run my therapy center and I do all of this psychoeducational and training and online coursework in the world, all with the idea of filling the gap of what would have been so helpful for me 20, 25 years ago, right? I mean, I write
Yeah.
for younger Annie, I do the work for younger Annie. And it just turns out a lot of people resonate with it and a lot of people need the work too.
Yeah. That's incredible. And I hope you take in, you're helping others all the time, and I just hope you really take in what you've created, both as the mission, but also as a business owner. Like you've grown a team to serve more people. You've
Mhm.
figured out how to grow this model and create a very successful company. So I just want to draw everyone's attention to that. That
Thank you.
Annie is in the trust because she's built her organization to this level, which not
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
um, people in your position do. Sometimes it's easier to just have the practice by yourself and, lock the door at
Totally.
5 and go home. And,
Totally. Yeah.
it was a decision. And so obviously that decision was linked to your mission and impacting more people.
It
I
was.
assume that's what got you through all these, like, it's not easy to grow the team and grow the bit.
No.
Like,
Oh
yeah.
my gosh, it's been the hard one of the hardest things I've ever done. And the piece I'll thank you, Allie. I am taking in my accomplishments and quite frankly, I'll just like, pat myself on the back further. First in my family to go to college, childhood abuse history. Like my mom scrubbed toilets for other people to put food on the table for us when my father left, right? I now create really high six-figure jobs for other people. I literally help impact, other people's lives by providing them benefits, not to mention doing my clinical work. So I'm really proud of what I've done, especially given where I started from. And I talk very openly about my story because I want my life to be a model too. Again, you can come from very, very little. And in fact, you can come, like a mile behind the starting line of your peers, and you can still create something really extraordinary, especially if you do the personal work. Um,
Yeah.
so thank you for naming that. And yes, building this business has been one of the hardest things I have ever done. I always say to people, especially to other entrepreneurs, if you want to know what your personal stuff is, especially what's unresolved, be in long-term romantic relationship or build your own business and then you'll see your stuff, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
I've learned all the lessons. I've had to learn all the lessons growing this company to, I think it's going to be at 3.2 when we close this year. I've had to learn all the lessons and I've had to work on my own stuff every step of the way. And I also launched the business when my daughter was 3 months old. So I've been raising her the last 5 years too. That's been a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So amazing. And it's been such a pleasure to have you in the trust. I have to say, I feel like you're our, uh, staff therapist for all of us. I remember seeing when I saw your application come in, I was talking to you the first time, like, oh, this is going to be great. Like, we're going to try not to like,
Oh,
overwhelm her, but we're all like, hi, can we talk to you for a minute? And it's been just such a pleasure to have you within the group.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I love being part of the group. I think for me, I don't get to have these conversations with um, I mean, I love the other moms at preschool, et cetera, but none of them necessarily own companies, right? And so the things that are always in the back of my mind are not the things that are really resonant with a lot of people in my daily life. But when I get together in the room with the women at the trust, there are people who are speaking my language, who are trying to solve the same level of problem, who are thinking with the same level of complexity. And it's just been a true gift to be in the room and to
Mm.
be having those conversations. And I'm just so grateful we connected and that I get to be part of the trust.
So my last question, actually, and then like a one quick fun question afterwards. I'm just doing a time
Sure.
check. What is the reward for you?
I think that the reward for me, and I'm going to interpret this in my own way, because I have to ask myself this on a daily basis. Why do I get up and do 9-hour workdays of really hard things all of the time and listen to really hard content and have hard conversations and figure out really big problems? Sometimes I have to ask myself this. The reward is I feel like I am truly attempting to maximize my personal potential and I'm leaving an impact on this planet that's one of good versus harm. So that's my reward. This work, this body of work that I'm leaving
Mm.
behind, that's my legacy as much as my daughter is. So that's ooh, I can feel the emotion coming up too. It will
Yeah.
last after I'm gone, my writing, my teaching, all of that. And that's my reward, to leave an impact that will help even one person feel less suicidal, less alone, more hopeful, or more equipped. So that's my reward.
Mm. There's a reason you're with us on the planet right now, Annie. There's a
Mm.
reason you're here during this time. I just know that so strongly. And I think many of us are here as light workers, right? We're like
Mm.
shining that light, helping others, showing them the way, handling our own stuff on the way too. But I just feel that so strongly about you. So
Thank
thank you for
you.
the gifts that you give. And I loved seeing the joy in, though I could tell that there's joy in that, in you giving these gifts and helping others. And my last question is so inconsequential, but I have to ask it. So do you have the Esselin kale salad recipe? Do you know
Oh
what I'm
my
talking
god,
about?
I worked in the Esalen kitchens. I made that dish like
Okay.
300 times. Totally,
So
totally.
I went to it. Okay, so there's like this story behind the salad and I have to tell it. So I who was I dating? This was like 2010. I don't even remember who it was. Um, South Bay, this volleyball guy who like lived in a 3-mile radius, so that's why it didn't work. Like the volleyball guys in South Beach, and if you're in LA and you date, you know what happens. Like there's people don't go beyond a certain boundary. So we're at his house, and his sister brings over this kale salad, and I'm like, "Stop everything!" I was like, I mean, I just like jumped up, and I'm like, What is this kale salad?" She's like, "It's the Esselin kale salad," and I said, I mean, I just was like following her around the house. I'm like, "You have to give this to me. Where do I find this?" And so she sent me the recipe, and I make that thing every week. The Esselin kale salad recipe, and
Yeah,
so I'm thrilled to
yeah.
meet someone else who knows what it is.
You're gonna have to put this in the show notes. I mean, like,
Okay.
not only do I know what this is, like, I made it for the 300 workshop participants at Esalen. So, like, you make a little salad for your family. I was making, like, these big trough bowls
Like,
for like, the recipe is burned into my brain, and it is definitely one of my show off dishes that I bring to, like, potlucks or, like,
oh, people
preschool
go
things, right?
crazy.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
it's amazing.
men, women, like old, young, everyone loves the Esselin kale salad. Okay, do you have other recipes that you could share that would be
I mean,
good?
I yeah, the other ones aren't as great, but totally. I'll share it with you when
Mm.
we get together at the next meeting.
Okay, we're gonna put a link in the show notes. I know it's out there somewhere, but yeah, that's a game
Okay.
changer. So I just had
So
to ask, and I can't. I'll ask you more Esselin questions,
yeah, that
like at
was
the
totally
cocktail.
yeah. And I will throw one other thing in here. So not only did Estlin kind of like give me kale salad and help me sort of put myself back together and, put me on my career trajectory, it is also where I met my husband, Kyle. He was also working and living at Estlin at the time. So we're one of those
Aw,
rare examples of an Estlin couple that has endured and we have our kid is an Estlin child. So it
Esselin
definitely is a
baby.
place she's an Esalen baby. And so I would definitely encourage anyone to go visit Esalen. It's such a magical gift to give to yourself to take a workshop there and just be on those Big Sur coastal acres. It really is a magical place in the world.
Yeah. So cool. All right. I loved ending with the salad. That was awesome. Annie, thank you. And give out your website one more time where people can go take that quiz. That
Sure,
sounds great.
sure. So my personal website is anniewright.com. And if you live in California or in Florida and you're thinking you might want to explore trauma therapy, my center is evergreencounseling.com. And we'd love to hear from you there.
Okay. I think we'll get some inquiries. All right. Thanks, Annie.
You're welcome,
Take
Allie. Thank
care.
you so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Subscribe now to the Reward Podcast to be sure to not miss an episode. And don't forget to visit jointhetrust.org to learn more about our modern community for forward-thinking 7- and 8-figure women entrepreneurs. You can learn more, apply to join us, or refer another woman you know who is over the $1 million mark and is ready for a different type of women's network. We have events coming up both live and online that are truly creating new possibilities for female leaders. That's jointhetrust.org. See you there.